A bit of a clarification, if I may. Thanks for this here. And that is that these categories that you see, high negativity, poor anger management, wide mood variability, high reactivity, poor stress resilience, high defensiveness, those are not Post terms. Those are Dave Corey terms. So you won't find them in the Post dimensions. As I read the Post counterproductive behaviors, though, that illustrate emotional regulation and stress tolerance, and there are many of them, as I read the appendices that describe the underlying critical incident methodology used to identify these Big Ten, these are the categories of underlying counterproductive behaviors and traits that I identify in my reading of it. So this is simply a way for me to cluster the various kinds of emotional regulation and stress tolerance problems. As I read them, I see a candidate with high negativity, or a candidate with poor anger management, or wide mood variability, or high reactivity, that is an external locus of control, poor stress resilience, and high defensiveness, or high defensiveness. As separate categories, you could have one or all of the above in a particular candidate. So it's just my own way of analyzing them. Furthermore, Post does not cluster their Big Ten. I cluster them into 4 categories. So I want to be clear that these are my messing around with Post dimensions. Now, having said that, Shelley has used it herself in her own training, so I don't think it's antithetical, Shelley Spielberg being the California Post muckety-muck, big cheese, the great kahuna of California Post, the chief senior personnel psychologist, I think is the actual term. And so I have her at least tacit support for using these structure that I apply to the Post team. But they're not requirements in any way. Also within the emotional control cluster are avoiding damaging and excessive risk-taking behavior and impulse control, attention to safety. These are Post categories: unsafe driving practices, inattention to safety, and poor impulse anger control. Now, you notice that impulse control and anger control are reflected here, but also remember seeing them in the first, emotional control. Some see that as a problem, these sort of orthogonal, non-orthogonal issues in the Post dimensions, that there's overlap among them. Actually, I think it's a feature of them that is an important. It's important to grasp that in psychological screening, is that these are not clearly distinct categories. It's simply a way of composing the behavior sample of an applicant. And there are different, you can frame it in different ways. Ultimately, all of them come together, all of these criteria together define qualification. It's not categorical. It's just a way of helping you to communicate and capture the criteria and to communicate and capture your assessment of the candidate. So all of these criteria should serve you in 2 ways. One is to help you define what your methodology is going to be for evaluating the candidate. It's going to help you select your instruments. It's going to help you select your interview questions. It's going to help you select your data sources for collateral information. It's going to have a controlling influence on the data you collect and analyze. There are some things that are not represented in the criteria that you're not going to concern yourself with. But if it's represented and it's important to these dimensions, then you'll include it in your analysis. The other way in which it's going to influence you is how you communicate with your agency. This provides a vehicle. By having an agreed upon standard against which you're evaluating a candidate, you now have a vehicle for communicating to the agency as to why the person is regarded as qualified and why the person is regarded as unqualified. Now, as an added benefit of being able to, as an added outcome of those two benefits, you're also in a much better position to defend your process and your conclusions to a jury, should that ever become necessary. I never believe that objective is the reason for doing anything that you do. Instead, I think that risk management is simply a great, it's an expected outcome from good practice. So the best risk management practice is good practice. And the best good practice is practice that's compliant with the standards of the community and consistent with regulatory and statutory requirements. So continuing on, assertiveness, persuasiveness, again, these three are Dave Corey messing around. It's the structure that I apply to it, it's not Post. As I view the three potential problems in the area of assertiveness, and I don't think assertiveness and persuasiveness captures it, in my view, well enough. When I say a person has a problem with assertiveness, that suggests that they're not assertive enough. That's one category. There's another category, and that's the one that has this overbearing control. And then there's another person who is simply not just passive, but they are neglectful. They just don't. It doesn't even register with them. Let me give you an example. I had an applicant that I saw just earlier this week who had failed a probationary period with another agency. And when asked by the interview panel, this information came to me from the chief later in a conversation I had with him. I didn't know it at the time. When he was asked by the panel why he failed his probationary period, his field training with the previous agency, he said he didn't know. He said, they don't tell you. Well, fair enough. They don't necessarily lay it out in a very clear way. But he said, did you get daily observation reports? Did you get DORs? I said, yeah. Okay, if you got DORs, they're telling you every day what the problem is. Now, here was the problem. The problem is this guy wasn't doing his reports. He would sit on them. It'd be so delinquent that the reports would, that eventually the prosecutor would have to drop charges against the arrestee because they didn't have a report to prosecute in court and a timely trial couldn't take place, timely prosecution. That's a big deal in police work. He had at times 16 reports that were not completed, and he'd stuff them in his gym bag so that they wouldn't be found sitting around. Now, when he's asked, why did you fail? He says, I don't really know. Give me a break. He knows. Now, he presents on his, how many of you use the PAI or familiar with it? Very high PIM, both incumbent norms and applicant norms. Excuse me, both the community norms and applicant norms. His LR on the MMPI-2 RF, his revised LI is up. Or excuse me, it's not called LI anymore, it's called L. Just L. His L is elevated. And his GI on the CPI is also elevated, and his fake good index is about a 63, which is very, very high. So the GI minus his CM is probably 32. This guy is presenting as a water walker. So should it be any surprise that he reports he doesn't know? Now, I'm telling you, this guy is not lying to me. He really doesn't know. This is a guy who falls into this category. He's just oblivious. So when they asked him to rate what he thought his competency was as a police officer in this prior agency, He said, on a 10-point scale, I was a 9. So they let go a 9. Yeah. Why don't you give yourself a 10? I don't think anybody ever gets a 10. That's something you get, that's sort of theoretical. So within the practical range of scores, you're the highest. Yes. That's his view of himself. So this is a guy who neglected because he doesn't even scan. He has no vigilance at all.
Got a banana in it.
Doesn't see it. So it's not a matter of his being passive. It's a matter of his being very inattentive in his external world, as well as his internal world. Yes.
You also see that when you're asking them about a time when they could have been assertive and weren't. There just aren't those times.
Right.
They just
Right.
don't
Yeah,
see
they're
the
not gonna see it.
necessity.
Exactly right. Okay, so also within cluster B, interpersonal behavior, social competence. These two are my structures, not post structures, and that is there's within the ways in which people can be socially incompetent. There are three that I see as most relevant to the police applicant that are problematic. There's the overbearing insensitivity, sort of the authoritarian type. There's the oblivious insensitivity, the person who's they're not trying to be an asshole. They just don't even, they're not paying attention to how they come across at all.
More narcissistic?
I'm not sure, I mean, narcissism may be one I think that's independent of the style. And then there's an aggressive intolerance, the person who just really is very judgmental of people, who has a very short sort of attitudinal fuse, who expects a tremendous amount from people, and who's prone to see people as problematic. And that, one sort of subgroup of that would be the person who was victimized throughout their developmental history by authoritarian father, probably an alcoholic father. And so whenever they engage with what they consider to be capricious authority, they get very reactive. They're very intolerant, and they come back in a very hostile way because of, naturally, that developmental history. That plays a big role in their aggressive intolerance. So these are three categories that I find as I read through the counterproductive behaviors, but they're not part of the post guidelines, excuse me, the post criteria. And then there's teamwork. The third cluster that as I structure the post guidelines, is cluster C, or judgment and flexibility, and that includes decision-making and judgment, and adaptability and flexibility. And then finally, cluster D, what we might call work attitudes, or a work orientation, and that's conscientiousness and dependability. These are the categories that POST uses, and integrity and ethics.